What a treat to have Scott Corwin from Deloitte with us today. As people who listen to this podcast will know, it's been an interesting year-long journey for me, Scott, in terms of learning about the importance of the climate issue, learning about the importance of the things that each of us can do individually to contribute to a solve for the challenge that is climate, and what the role of companies can play, and how there's a movement seems to be developing, and things happen when movements take place. And you were at the earliest part of my journey on this issue and helping me to learn and discover. And the neat thing about us getting to chat with you today, Scott, is in your role at Deloitte as the U.S. leader for sustainability and climate change, you have two responsibilities. One is to help shape the behavior of Deloitte as an enterprise in terms of its own efforts to be a good citizen and contribute to the improvement of the climate situation. And at the same time, you're helping Deloitte shape its business of helping its clients do the same thing. So let's start there. Help us have a level set, Scott, in terms of what is the state of the climate situation today, and tell us how Deloitte came to the sense of their own responsibilities and the opportunity to play a leadership role in this very important question.
Yeah, well, great. Jim, thank you very much for inviting me to have this conversation with you. I do feel like you said, it's sort of, we've had an ongoing dialogue for the better part of a year now. And I think all of us every day learn new things. And I think it's really important that we approach this really complex undertaking with an incredible open mind. So let's just start with a few basic building blocks. While there are really a number of positive signals recently, there's still a massive chasm between where we are and where we need to get to. Just to put that in context, the UN IPCC has said that we need to cut emissions by half by 2030. And today we currently emit roughly 60 gigatons of carbon, and it's growing. It's not actually shrinking. Now, it shrunk a little bit during COVID because people were staying home.
Which was an interesting, unnatural experiment, I would guess, huh?
Exactly. I mean, it gave us a feel for, I spoke to, in the middle of all of that, the head of transportation for the city of Los Angeles, who lives several miles from the ocean. And she said, we can see like the smog, in clean air. So it was a moment in time where we sort of saw some things. Here's sort of the challenge. Here, we're up to sort of 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide emissions. But here's the other interesting piece of that. More than half of the cumulative carbon dioxide emissions have occurred since 1990. So think about that, 33 years, all of mankind, right? From the industrial age till now, it's really been in the last 30 years.
Let's contextualize that a little bit, Scott. Sure. What do you think a sustainable level of carbon emissions? That is, carbon is a natural element. We unnaturally create excess amounts of carbons through our consumption of fossil fuels primarily. But we have an ecosystem on the globe, and trees and plants and foodstuffs are consuming carbon. Contextualize that unbelievable number, 60 gigatons. What would be a sustainable amount that would be a good, natural, able to be digested and used in its proper and intended form?
Well, the answer to the question of what is a good level to get to is, I'm not a climatologist, but the UN IPCC is basically saying we have to cut that 60 gigatons by half to 2030, and then again a half from 2030 to 2040, and half again to 2050, and we have to get to net zero. And here's the
so that's the answer to my question.
Yeah, but I'm citing the UN because it's the authoritative source with the community, the COP protocols, These are come out of the Paris Agreement targets. They're still the essentially the goal that collectively people are trying to get to. And what the Paris Agreement said.
That's 7.5 tons in 2050 if we accept the science of the UN science community. And that's our goal. Is that to not be doing any more damage, or does that in any way start to turn back the clock?
No, it's first not to do any damage, but ultimately to start to turn the clock. So
I see.
What happens is, and again, I am not a scientist, but I think what's important is that when we emit carbon dioxide, it sits in the atmosphere for hundreds, if not, for many, many years. And unless you build all the sinks you're talking about, which would mean the oceans absorbing carbon, trees, all sorts of different forms, or direct air capture and technological innovations, right? There isn't a turning back the clock quickly. However, the one area where we can make a lot of progress is particularly around methane. Methane has a much shorter active life in the atmosphere. And methane typically comes from the flaring of, natural gas. It comes from agriculture, particularly in terms of animal byproducts. Yeah, and we can make more progress on methane, but it's not an either or. None of these things are either or. And so
But is methane shorter life? But is it more? I've heard, it's my impression, it's more dangerous.
That's what I understand as well. And what's happened, I think, in the last several years is an increased recognition that if we don't get to net zero and then eventually to net positive, which is what you're talking about, climatic changes on this planet are only going to get more severe, right? We're going to see the polar ice caps melt. We're going to see rising temperatures. We're going to get above the Paris Agreement target of trying to keep the planetary temperature from rising above 1.5 degrees, ideally under 2, closer to 1.5. We're already well on our way to 1.3. So we're likely to go north of 1.5. And the question is, can we keep it under 2? And that will take sort of extraordinary sets of measures for us to be able to do that.
So on our dashboard, as a people, as a country, as companies, the community that you're so plugged into, people who understand this issue, it seems to me there's two dials we're looking at now: carbon emissions, and then there's a subdial of methane emissions.
There are all sorts of other climatological effects that are caused by humans that are not just carbon and not just methane. Some of them, and you went there, which is you have these natural ecosystems that are highly interactive where, something happens here, it has an effect there. You
Right.
Look at the way that the ocean currents work, the air and temperature currents, like all of that stuff is being affected. Plastics in the water are not necessarily a carbon thing. They're produced by carbon, but it's the impact that, we're doing to, sea life and all the rest that are happening. So there's these incredible interactive effects. And, I think what's also interesting about that is that the biodiversity of the planet is increasingly getting more attention because of the highly interconnected nature of those things. And it's no less important, quite frankly, than climate change. That if we lose species that are critical to
Ecosystem.
the whole ecosystem of life on this planet, it will have repercussions, and it's beginning to have repercussions. So the delicate balance, and again, there are scientists who could go into much greater depth with you on this, the highly interactive and sensitive nature of these things, we're hitting tipping points. And so it is what's leading to the urgency of this. And, increasingly what you're seeing is communities, populations, people who have been most affected by this, investors, shareholders, governments, like there's an increasing population that this is at the top of the agenda. I mean, we just did a survey of CXOs, and in that survey, what's really interesting is that climate change ranks as one of the top 3 issues. It's actually right behind the economic outlook of CXOs. We just completed that study. We released it last week, and it was a global study. And 75% of those CXOs said their organizations have significantly increased their investments over the last year. 20% have said that their investments have increased significantly. 2/3, 6 out of 10 say they feel concerned about climate change all or most of the time, but they're really feeling the pressure to transform from customers, suppliers, employees, regulators, and investors. You can go around the globe and sort of see how those stakeholders are heavily influencing it, and how, inside either different sectors or different countries or different geographies or different communities, the collective effect of all that.
Wow, that's amazing. Those survey results, a global survey, and to see the C-suite that concerned about climate, I think that's surprising to me, and it's also encouraging. Is it different in different regions of the world? I had a chat recently with a terrific young lady named Natalia Brzezinski. She was married to the ambassador to Sweden under Barack Obama. And she became a darling in Sweden because she wasn't just, hosting parties. She decided that she was going to make a difference and embrace the tech community of Sweden and built a bridge to the tech community in North America, particularly in the U.S. And so the people of Sweden thought she was, hot stuff and did some wonderful, wonderful things. But she said in the course of our conversation that the Scandinavian countries, she lived in Denmark while she was an exchange student and of course for several years working with the ambassador. She said it's much more a part of the culture of the Scandinavian people to understand that they are of the earth and they have to be good stewards of the earth. They think of it just much more naturally than we might here in the U.S. So what global differences did you see?
What we're seeing across the U.S. related to all of that, because
Please.
that's where I've spent my time. This issue is rising on the agenda of C-suites. You and I have spent a lot of time with corporate leaders in lots of different forums, whether it's, I was in CES a couple of weeks ago, I was in Davos last week.
Big topic in Davos?
Big topic in Davos. And the centrality of the topic is that here's sort of one of the, I think, really interesting points that has to be dealt with. Unlike other transformations, when we went from an agricultural, agrarian economy to eventually an industrial economy to the information age and digitization, they had natural cycles. Of course, they had all sorts of disruptive effects in the transformation. But this one has a time clock sitting over us that if we're going to affect change to make this planet more habitable for humans, then we have to address these things on a accelerated time clock compared to sort of letting things happen organically. And the example of that is you look at what's happened in energy. Renewable energy now is economically competitive with fossil fuel alternatives. But
and that's a huge tipping point, isn't it?
It's a massive tipping point, but it's taken 3 decades to get there, and we don't have 3 decades. And by the way, we have to scale photovoltaic solar, we have to scale wind renewable and geothermal and hydro and all of those sources, and we need to do it faster. And the reason is that if we have any chance of reaching the targets set in the Paris Accord, it really starts with the central foundation is the decarbonization of the energy system and the transition to clean energy that then feeds into our transportation and mobility system that is integrally connected to the way that we produce industrials and manufacturing. It's central to what we do in food. That's why when you and I first started talking, we started talking about the work that we're doing at Deloitte around systems approaches. And fundamentally, as we talked about last March when we first met, is you and I could do everything with our families and our households. And it's important, and we should do it, but we need 8 billion other people to join with us, right? Corporations are making very laudable setting of goals to get to net zero by mid-century or something to that effect. But to be honest, while all of that's important and necessary, it's not sufficient because they can only control so much of their direct actions. And they're highly dependent upon upstream and downstream value chains that they operate in. And to affect the change we're talking about, you actually need to move holistic systems together with collaboration and with groups of players. That was a central theme that we've been on for almost 2 years now, but it's really finding its voice now. It is incredible to me how you hear it across all of these different economic systems or key leaders in energy, in transportation, in food, in industrials, and there's a recognition that they need to get there. So the argument of the imperative of adopting systems, I believe, is rising. There's a growing chorus of understanding that importance. And now we're shifting from, so what does that mean? What does systems mean? And how do you...
That's my question.
Well, I will try to provide some insights to it. It is the central focus of what our team is doing at Deloitte, and it really is the North Star of the work.
If I were to guess ahead there, Scott, I'm thinking, if here at the Flowers companies, if we do everything we can to separate our trash into recyclables, and you put it outside and it goes in a truck and they just mix it all together again, that's a lack of a system. So you have appropriate behavior at one point, but if the system, the full cycle system isn't in place, it's wasted effort.
You will see that point, I think, all across these value chains. And so we're kind of living in a really interesting moment. This is another key point coming back to where you started. We actually have a lot of the technologies we need to decarbonize these systems. We will need breakthroughs to get to the last 20, 25, or 30% as we get closer to mid-century. But the reality is, when you look at a lot of these value chains, we actually have the technologies. We have some real challenges that people are calling chicken and egg challenges. And the issue is, I'll just give you a couple of examples. So let's talk about like electric vehicles. We've had electric vehicles for a while. I did a lot of work with the automotive industry, and I could, cite for you probably 25 different graphs over the last 20 plus years that showed a hockey stick adoption of EVs. And the simple reality is that you can create an EV, but if you don't build a relatively ubiquitous charging network that, by the way, uses clean energy, right? And then potentially you use recycled materials or full end-to-end recycling, right? You're not actually going to fundamentally, you won't get to the adoption rates you need. And early on, the battery technology was an issue. Individual consumers legitimately had a concern about range anxiety. And because they had conceived of owning a car the way we have for almost a century, going back to Henry Ford. It was the great freedom to be able to go anywhere. There was gas stations that took 5 minutes to refuel, and you were not limited. If you were to have bought an EV 10 or 15 years ago, you would have, unless you were in California, and even there, you wouldn't have found many chargers. And so, it's one thing if you're just using it as a daily commute or it's how you go to work. But now what's starting to happen is the charging network is getting stronger. It's not perfect. They've got a long ways to go. The IRA, there's a lot of funding for it. So we are at a really interesting tipping point in electric vehicles. But I think here's the point that gets lost in this. We don't really want to move from a model like in the United States where we have 280 million cars on the road. In a country of 300 million people, which means there's more than one car per licensed driver. And most of them, sadly, are sort of single occupant, used in a single occupant way, which is why we have all these traffic jams and congestion into cities. But the model can't ultimately be to swap out every gas and diesel car with an electric vehicle and essentially think that we've made massive progress. We will have helped on the decarbonization, assuming we get the energy right. The trick, I think, is to work with some of the large fleets like the ride-hailing companies or the delivery couriers. Let's get them on the road.
But in confined areas, which lends itself to electrification.
Could, arguably, yes. And the more miles we get converted to clean energy vehicles, the more rapid progress we make on decarbonization. And the good news is that there are now a lot of government incentives to help do that. When you talk to the ride-hailing companies or you talk to the delivery fleets, they're very focused on it. The bigger delivery fleets are looking at hydrogen when that's coming down the path. So we're now essentially talking about changing the asset base over a period of time and how quickly do you do it. And I mean, you've run a very successful business and you know that you have to look at the business case for these things. They cannot be that you're going to pay a massive green premium just for altruistic reasons. The economics, or you're not going to do it if your competitors don't do it because it'll put you at a competitive disadvantage. And that is, in a capitalist system, a totally legitimate thing. But we have this sort of interim period of how do you get to the transition? And so we have to think about, do you form supply side consortiums where the developers of these chargers and the energy companies that are providing the electricity, that they work together in some way so that they build the supply side faster? And do you get the demand side where you get corporate customers, for example, to say, we're willing to pay a bit of a green premium so that you have greater assurance of the risk of that capital investment? And we're seeing all sorts of those kind of innovations going on. Again, not fast enough, but that is how we're going to begin to really move forward on the adoption through systems and get through the S curves that are necessary for these adoptions. It's still really early. We're all learning, like, how do you actually do that? How do you work together in kind of non-traditional forms of collaboration? Another good example, and one that is really quite pressing, is like sustainable aviation fuel. There's no great answer for aviation today. 80% of the emissions in our air travel, comes from the production and the consumption of the fuel that goes into those airplanes. 18%, this was really surprising to me, is the ground transportation of how we get to and from the airport, which then leaves you with relatively small numbers around airport operations, all of the ground operations. There's some things about if you change the route patterns of airplanes, you could reduce emissions, but they're kind of low single digits in terms of what they're going to do. So
they don't get at the heart of it, yeah.
Right. So if you want to get to the leverage point, the tipping point that's going to make a difference. So here's what's interesting about sustainable aviation fuel. It's a bridge technology. So it's kind of like ethanol in cars. You can use a biomass, you can use recycled materials, and it can be processed and then put into those same jet engines. So you do not need a whole new fleet of airplanes, and it cuts those emissions by 50%. But here's the rub. Today, a gallon of sustainable aviation fuel in the United States is roughly 4 times the equivalent of a gallon of jet fuel 1A. And
wow, is that right? 4 times. But let's look down the road there a little bit. I would have to guess traveling is carbon producing. We have to travel. Do we have to travel as much? I'm sure that's something you guys look at all the time. And I know your previous work at Deloitte was all around about the future of mobility. So you get to take your learnings and your experiences there and roll them right into the work you're doing now in terms of sustainability, which I think is interesting. But I've heard from other people, and you and I together have heard from people like Ryan Chetpansaram, who did the work with John Doerr on their book all about Climate, it's saying it's not too late. Their point was the first place we should work is on the transportation system. And what you're talking about now with sustainable aviation fuel, I that's an interesting point you made that I hadn't thought of before, which is everyone says, but that's not the real solution. You're talking about it being a bridge to a better solution. And I think that's how we need to think incrementally, that you can't wait for everything to be perfect. You have to be moving in the right direction. But to say that you could reduce the emissions by 50%, clearly you must see at some point where there's a tipping point where that cost per gallon of aviation fuel is the equivalent if it's sustainable.
So what you've just hit upon is the chicken and the egg problem, and what we want to do is create flywheels. You want to create a flywheel for the production side. So the energy companies, the fuel service companies, the refiners, right, to have the incentive to invest. If you put yourself in their shoes, what they say is, okay, we get it, but if we invest all this capital to build more productive capacity, what happens when we get a little further along and there are new sources of energy for flying? So now it's great for the world, but it may not be great for our bottom line, right? We're going to make capital asset investments that are important. And the airlines themselves, understandably, they can't incur this cost because their profitability, they'll incur some of it, and then you've got tax incentives, and then you've got large corporate customers that are flying that are willing to pay a bit of a premium. And the reason that they're willing to do that is they've made pledges and commitments to get to net zero by 2030, 2040, 2050, and they're trying to buy renewable carbon credits. But it would be a darn sight better to take the dollars we're spending on renewable carbon credits and apply it to the actual decarbonization, so you don't actually need those carbon credits. And as we get closer to 2030, the cost of those credits is going to go up very significantly. Governments
need to play here, because there needs to be, I'm a behaviorist, and you're seem to me that you're very much a behaviorist as well, that you have to incent the right behaviors. You have to anticipate that some things are going to be interim and temporary. There's capital that needs to go into those things. And how do you protect those investments so that people feel comfortable making them, that when a bridge's need deteriorates, that they're not stuck holding the bag?
There are a couple of other elements to that, though. So you have now a changing regulatory environment. About the SEC is coming down. They've issued for feedback a new set of rules. Europe has had them in terms of the disclosures that corporations have to make. There will be spotlights in terms of scope 1, scope 2, but this one that we're talking about is a scope 3 for most corporates. There will be much greater sort of transparency about what's going on there. And then secondly, and it's not trivial, is that Wall Street increasingly, maybe right in the moment with the headwinds we have related to the war and inflation and energy security, but over some period of time, and we were seeing a movement this way, Wall Street is valuing companies in terms of where they are in terms of their ESG progress. And you also want to look with peripheral vision about what your direct competitors are doing. So there is
competition.
You and I grew up in an era where, in terms of optimizing shareholder wealth and sort of being number one or number two in the industries and sectors we compete in and all the rest. Well, one of the things, so it talked a lot about early mover advantage, that if you sort of, discovered new market spaces and you figured out how to get there, you could secure a really strong position. In this instance, actually doing all the low carbon stuff, especially if you're in a high abating sector, may give you a competitive disadvantage. And therefore, everyone's sort of like, I'd almost rather naturally be a fast follower. And you see that in steel and cement and chemicals and other places, right? Because the bottom line is that those companies that make chemicals that are, from molecules to sort of semi-finished product or, bumpers that are on cars, well, the procurement officer at a major OEM isn't going to necessarily pay a premium for a low carbon form of plastic, although they want it, because at the end of the day, will their customer pay them the premium that's needed?
A year ago, when you and I talked about whether or not there was a movement developing, and you remember in New York during UN Climate Week, when Worth Techonomy put on the climate event that you were so much on the leadership of, we finished up with Seth Godin as our keynote closer. Yep. And he talked about movements and how movements form. And he reminded me that day that when I was young and just had young kids, it was when I had young kids that I had no choice but to wear a seatbelt, because the movement started. The kids were, Daddy, you have to wear your seatbelt. And now I wouldn't think of getting into a car without putting a seatbelt on. It's rote, and it has been all of my adult life. So that's the indications of a movement. And I see that now in the workplace, right?
Yeah.
You're in the business of making sure Deloitte is being the best citizen it can be, but you're also in the business of helping your clients be the best citizens they can be, and bringing knowledge and bringing a forum where the best practices can be decided, because our workforces are our kids of 50 years ago insisting that they'll only work someplace that they feel good about because of what we're doing vis-a-vis climate.
I think you're spot on, and we understand that. So, COVID was a sort of really interesting thing for us. We're the world's largest professional service firm.
Is that right? I didn't realize that. The largest professional services firm. Wow.
Professional service firm. We have over 400,000 employees globally. We basically work with every organization of any consequence on the planet in some form. We have 4 businesses. We have a audit and assurance business. We have an advisory business. We have a consulting business, and we have a tax business. What's
the difference between the advisory and the consulting?
So advisory, a lot of that is sort of split in a few different areas. We do a lot of risk advisory, resilience work. We do a lot of financial advisory and due diligence work
I got you.
In terms of deals, and we're building major digital tools for our clients. Consulting is pretty traditional in many ways, but because of our size and scale, we're able to do things in our consulting business. We basically work from the beginning in terms of strategy to helping our clients design and implement their transformations. And then in many instances, we'll play an active role in helping them to operate parts of that business and sort of systems kind of work and digital tools and all sorts of things. So So
if XYZ Corporation comes to you and said, we're hearing from our people all the time, we're doing a little bit of this recycling here, we're trying to reduce our energy consumption with these things, but we don't feel like we have a holistic approach here, and they call Deloitte, Scott, would your team come in and be able to do a proper assessment of what they're doing, give them that middleware layer of things where they can create new initiatives, monitor that, and roll it up to a dashboard where they can look at their stakeholders, their investors, their clients, their team members, and say, here's our dashboard. We're making a difference. You can all be a part of that. Ideas should come. Am I guessing properly in terms of how you help a client to do the right thing here and do the best thing for their business at the same time?
You're right on the center of what we're doing. So I sit at the corporate level, and I help to co-lead this practice commercially. I no longer have direct oversight of what we're doing internally. I help to get that started in the US.
I remember that.
My heart and soul has always been with clients. But yes, I mean, what we're doing is we're creating a whole of Deloitte approach with the way that we work with clients. We have 5 integrated offerings. So the first one is, how do we help you build a roadmap to get to net zero? It's grounded in all sorts of empiricism, where we work on terms of developing the strategies and the game plans. We've built all sorts of digital tools, exactly what you've talked about.
So that's the software for measurement, that's the software for identification of areas of need.
All of that. And simulation. So let's play out different scenarios. Let's actually talk about, if you do X, Y, Z, what does it do to your operations? What does it do to your financials? What does it do to your workforce? ultimately, what does it do with our human capital team to the talent profile? Because you're exactly right that this is getting this right. If you're able to get out in front, our argument is that it's really hard to understand these tipping points, but they're coming and they're coming at a really fast pace. One hypothesis we have is that those that get out in front and actually lead and shape probably are positioning themselves for greater long-term durability and competitive advantage and longer-term profitability. And so
as a behaviorist, that's kind of important.
Yeah, it is important. So then secondly is disclosures, right? We're all about helping companies build the capabilities to do accurate disclosures and reporting and compliance. That's our legacy in the audit business. Third, we're completely re-engineering supply chains and value chains. We're doing that with either lead clients and then working upstream and downstream, or we're working with groups of players. We are doing a lot of work thinking about the equity elements to this.
What do you mean equity elements?
So I'm going to talk about that for a second. What it is it's about a just transition. When you think about the big cycles of economic change, when we went from an agrarian to a industrial transition, or industrial to information, like the old when you and I were in college, like the transition from the manufacturing economy to the information and services economy, and we lost all those jobs. We didn't really have good transitions, and it created a whole host of other problems. Communities that lost major employers, either in some instances, environmental degradation and health issues, education, and all those things that are absolutely critical to get right for thriving, prosperous, capable communities and whatnot. So we have to work on those things. And we're staring right at the front of this right now in terms of these transitions. If you're talking about transitioning every one of these major pillars of the economy.
So if you're Joe Manchin and you're from West Virginia and you guys produce a good amount of coal there, you better have an answer to his appropriate question. What am I going to do with all my coal miners?
Absolutely. And what's interesting is he was able in the legislation, the climate policy legislation, to put in, to get inserted into that, and others too, by the way, sort of a lot of things around just transition. The Biden administration did something else, which is that a lot of that funding also has to meet a requirement of what they call EJ 40, Environmental Justice 40. And the idea is that the dollars that are going to fund these new technologies need to be broadly distributed in terms of the benefits, and both in terms of employment and whatnot. And you've seen some great announcements recently in terms of, with the CHIPS Act, the Intel plant outside of Columbus, it's given us, and this sort of re-emphasis on rebuilding our domestic supply chains. The good news is, with the kind of distributed energy we're talking about, solar and wind does not have to be completely centralized in just a few locations. What we now need to do is build transmission lines, storage.
Seems like behaviorally, I've heard you say, let's work on mobility. Your old world, your new world collide there. Let's work on transportation, electrification of transportation. And calm down, naysayers. I know you're going to tell me, well, where does that energy come from? We're going to be simultaneously and sequentially working on transmission too, because you mentioned earlier, we've reached the tipping point in when the cost of production of wind and solar has now gotten to the point where it's at least the same or less than fossil fuels. So we're also working on on generation, but then after generation, transmission of electricity is inefficient and can likely be improved with new technologies so that you can send it over longer lines without the degradation of its effectiveness.
Storage is also important. So there's one other thing, though. And
go ahead.
In the spirit of complete candor, this is not a black and white thing. We are going to go through a period of decades of transition where we will need fossil fuels. So it's not a black and white, you shut it off and you turn on the other and bingo, you're there. Like, and it's that interim period that is going to be the most difficult because, the companies that are grounded in the fossil fuel world and all the assets they have, how do they begin to make this transition to a future? Are we going to see what we saw with the digital age and all these startups where essentially capital was almost virtually free and essentially you had innovators and disruptors disrupting legacy incumbents? Some of these things, we're talking about trillions of dollars of assets that need to be built. And so it's not as easy as sort of building a digital app that's going to disrupt, the world you live in, the media business, and how that happened. It's, of course, we'll see innovations that are really important. But as you know from some of the people you've had at Techonomy, like Bill Gross, he's talking about really big, massive kind of infrastructure changes that have incredible, benefits, but they're at least a decade away in many instances of scaling, and we need those things too. So it's a really complicated effort, and I think what we're trying to do is we don't want to position ourselves as though we're the experts. What we want to do is be a catalyst, and we want to convene the people that are on the front lines, and we want an open source platform. And I don't mean it as a digital platform, but we want to take the best ideas out there. And what we want to do is get the people who really want to shape this and move forward to demonstrate the progress we're having, how we can really shape this and get the pieces together. And it is going to require bringing together pretty non-traditional forms of collaboration. And our efforts in this, our North Star is the impact we're having in terms of this transition and the measurement in terms of helping our clients and the world and communities sort of successfully transition to a low carbon and much more equitable future. And that's, brings sustainability to the planet and to people. And if we get that right, it of course will have benefits to our business, but that's why it's the North Star, is that we have the ability to play a really, we think, supportive role in helping to move and shape this. And that's why it's so gratifying to me now, that we've been on this journey to start to see the chorus of voices getting there. And we welcome them, and we want to. So, we've got this sustainability systems initiative. We're working within these systems with different players. We want to build a movement of these leaders. And in talking to different corporate leaders and government leaders and NGO leaders and community leaders, there's a real hankering. Like, people really do want to feel like they're contributing in a collective way.
I would say on the journey that I've been and you helped me through this year, I'm more hopeful now than I was a year ago. And that's because two things. One, what you spoke about earlier, there is a sense of movement building here. And up from the bottom, everyone's interested. If you want to get the best talent, if you want to have the best ideas, you better be on board here because your people are demanding it. And then the part B of that is capitalism. It is now a great investment for people to invest in these solutions because of the tipping points, Scott Corwin, that you've spoken about here. And so I'm hopeful because when you unleash that capitalist spirit, which needs guardrails and it needs government incentives and it needs protections and it needs programs to help people transition, all of the things that you've mentioned. But when you unleash that spirit and the force of that capital, good things are going to happen.
We did a series of reports that we called the Deloitte Turning Point reports. It started from our Economics Institute. They first looked at Australia, then we did different regions. And what they were arguing is we've never actually looked at the economic impact of this transition. And the reason is that there were all these negative externalities tied to the fossil fuel-based economy that never get priced into these things. So essentially, given the weather effects, the productivity effects, the migration of people, all the bad things that happen if the planet keeps heating up, essentially, if we don't address this transition to clean energy quickly, the cost to the global economy in the next 50 years is $178 trillion. On the other hand, if we actually address this and get to a low carbon future, we will generate incrementally $43 trillion in gross domestic product for the global economy.
In your convening of these experts, in your creating an open source, single quotes, open source platform to bring the best ideas and discussion to the table, that's when things like the realization of the real costs of not acting and acting come to the fore. And with data, people will be motivated based on hard and clear and believable data. Well, Scott, you're terrific. And I've enjoyed the education you've given me over the past year, the good discussion we've had. I hope it continues for a long time because there's so much to happen. I gotta say, you're a pretty lucky guy. I mean, look at your career and the things you've done, the work on the future of mobility, how it led into your work on sustainability, how you get to work for the largest consulting organization in the world that has at its core wanting to do the right thing, charging you with helping them be part of the team that shaped Deloitte's own behavior and said, look, if we've done that work, let's harden it up. Let's develop the software and the measurements and the abilities and the convening capabilities to help our clients to do the same things we've done. But how lucky are you that you work with a company, Deloitte, that gets to do well by doing good? That's a pretty neat spot to be in.
It's not lost on me one bit, the idea that I am sitting in this incredible opportunity to make a difference. I've had a really long career in strategy and business transformation. I've worked across lots of sectors. It's taken me to places I never imagined. I've loved my career. And the good news is, Jim, for the rest of my life, I can engage in what I'm doing here. And it's a synthesis of so much of what I've done. And the firm has been incredibly generous to me in terms of encouraging me to kind of push and build the teams and to get out there, and a willingness to let me be a little provocative at times and sort of push and urge. And we have an amazing partnership, but we also have incredible leaders. And it's, I've only been here 9 years. I've been with 2 other major consulting firms and worked in a family business before that. And so, in a 40-year career, these last 9+ years, and it'll go on longer, I consider myself incredibly fortunate. And hopefully I'm making a difference. That's what I really care about.
Well, Scott, what I've learned in the past year is you're a good guy. Yes, you're a lucky guy, but you're making a difference. And we feel lucky to have gotten to know you, to work with you, and get to sit on the sidelines and cheer as you continue your career and make a difference.
Sidelines. We want you to get right in the scrum with us, and you are.
All right. Count us in.
And I appreciate our friendship very much. And thank you for really having this opportunity. It's been a great conversation.
All right. Keep making a difference, Scott Corwin.
See you soon.
All right, pal.